So this will start the session on pre-qualification. We have two speakers whose biography you can always read on the program. Roger Bickerstaff from Bird & Bird in London, and Hemanta Doloi from University of Melbourne. Roger, your turn. 30 minutes.
Okay, so qualification, bit of qualification. Starting to get into the detail a little bit here of the procurement process. And really I want to cover topics which should hopefully of interest to both the academic people in the audience and the practitioners in the audience, in the sense that procurement, as we've been hearing already this morning, has these very diverse communities attached to it. And bidder qualification, of course, from a practitioner's perspective, is a key risk area in the procurement process, in the sense that the point at which bidders are selected and deselected in particular is an area which is quite a risk area and a potential area for bidder challenge. And, so that from a practitioner's perspective, it's crucial that we get it right. And also, from a policy perspective, that clearly this is a really important area to ensure that the bidders that are available to the contracting authorities in the procurement process are in some way appropriate. The pool of bidders available to the contracting authorities are the sort of bidders that we want to take forward. And increasingly, we'll hear from Hemanta, is that that's now broadening out into much broader policy issues. So moving on from just deselecting those people that have not paid their taxes, that have been convicted of corruption, that have been involved in various offences of one sort or another, to now using bidder selection to try and move towards these policy goals of social perspectives and sustainability that we've been hearing about, and how do we do that within this bidder selection process. So this morning, I want to look at the theory side of things. I also want to look at the practitioner side and look at some specific issues in bidder qualification for practitioners and the sorts of things that we find in practice can cause difficulty. And that feeds into my personal background as a practicing lawyer. So I'm a practicing procurement lawyer. A number of you will have heard this story before, but actually started in this field actually a little bit before I've gained it. So I've been doing this work. I had to do the same. I've been doing this work for 30 years now. Back in 1989, as a trainee lawyer, I was told to go to the library in my law firm in London, because I was working for a firm called Linklaters, got a big international law firm, and nobody knew anything about this public procurement stuff. But we were advising the UK government actually on an IT project which is still operational. So we were advising on something called Chief, which was the customs handling IT system, which is still being operated. It's coming to the end of its life now. But these, even in IT projects, which are quite fast moving, these things sometimes have a very long life. And I was sent up as a trainee to look at these public procurement directors, because somebody thought, yeah, actually these things might be relevant to customs and excise. And so I read this 1977 directive and thought, wow, this looks like law. I said, but there's no law in the UK at that stage. And at that stage, the 1977 directives were implemented in the UK by letters, which were simply circulated around by central government, and the departments were told, you ought to take account of this. Things have obviously moved on during that 30-year period. But I just want to digress a little bit into a couple of policy dimensions before we get into the specifics, and also to just pick up on global governance, and it's a theme which is very dear to my heart, and one of the reasons why I think the IMPDM is such a great activity. And it does seem to me, coming particularly from the UK, I see this in quite stark terms, that the international consensus, again has been discussed about this morning in terms of the EU and the rule of law, is very much up for question, is under threat, is not being taken for granted in the way that we, as potentially as liberals around the room, thought it was a given. And I've been reading up a lot about the Brexit process and seeing how, there are significant forces which, are dissatisfied, with, the international consensus. So it's very much important for people like ourselves in things like the IMPPM to make sure that people really do have the tools and knowledge and understanding on an international basis to think through these issues and to take a leadership position. I want to make a comment again in relation to Brexit, in that about 6 years ago we invited somebody called Paul Nemitz, who I think quite a lot of you will have heard of Paul Nemitz, being one of the key proponents of the data protection regulation. We invited Paul Nemitz to come and speak to us. And we thought he was going to talk to us about the process around the implementation of the GDPR and what the implications of that would be. In fact, he came and he gave us, this is 6 years ago, he gave us quite a finger pointing. And he talked to us about the failure of United Kingdom liberals, myself, so it was very much talking to me, to take a leadership role in not standing up to the forces of Brexit and the liberal consensus, and allowing these forces to take sway, and as we've seen in the United Kingdom, to lead to a substantial result. So there's something of a warning there that yes, global governance is a practical issue. We want to think about it in practical terms, but it goes beyond that, and hopefully it's a topic we can discuss over dinner and the rest of the conference. To also pick up a little bit on this debate that we've been having already this morning between deliverability and compliance. And as well as being a procurement lawyer, I'm very much a technology lawyer. So most of my procurement advisory work is around large-scale technology projects of one sort or another. So, for example, one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is to replace the emergency services communication system for ambulance, fire and police in the United Kingdom with a move to 3G and 4G radios, so we'll be able to get a lot more data out to the ambulance, the police and the fire engines and much more quickly. And that's really important. My daughter was ill on Friday night, and even in London it took 2 hours for an ambulance to come. She's absolutely fine, it was just a little scare. But it took 2 hours for an ambulance to come, and so we were getting very worried about it. But it shouldn't take that, and part of that is communications, part of that comes down to deliverability and the importance of us as procurement practitioners, seeing these projects through. And I do get very frustrated with the legal framework sometimes. For example, the stuff in the European directives about post-award contract changes, and the inflexibility on the extent to which you can make contract changes post-award. I can see the theoretical understanding for that, the theoretical rationale for that, but as again is said, actually, these big significant projects are always different at the end of when they're delivered as to when they were contracted for. And there needs to be a realism in the procurement rules, to allow that flexibility to occur in a managed and appropriate way, so that projects really can be delivered. And again, that's perhaps the thing we can take forward. So back to disqualification and the underlying rationale of bidder exclusion. And firstly, I just want to give credit for this slide to Professor Eukins, who is not here today, but I lifted this from Professor Eukins, and it gives an overview of the various different exclusion strategies that are available on a worldwide basis. And I think it's useful to think about this, because I want to really set some questions in the first place from a theoretical perspective before getting to the practical side of things, really to ask the questions, why a bid is excluded? What is the purpose of excluding bidders at this early stage? And how do the various different systems around the world go about that exclusion process. And there are different ways of doing it, and as we can see here on the left-hand side, there's the EU and the US day-by-day basis, where exclusion is done by the contracting authorities on a case-by-case basis. So the contracting authorities look at the issues and decide whether or not to exclude bidders or not. In the US, there is the possibility of debarment, so across the board disqualification, and that's very much on an administrative basis in the States. And the World Bank also has a debarment arrangement. We'll look at a little bit in more detail later, which is more adjudicative rather than administrative. And then there is a possibility in some countries, I think Germany is one of those, where there can be court-ordered debarment. So there's a range of mechanisms which can be used for the exclusion of bidders. But we need to think about, well, why are we doing it? What's the purpose of this? Are we looking at performance risk? Are we looking at reputational risk? Are we looking at that pool of bidders that the contracting authority should have available from a policy perspective? How do we choose those bidders? So I want to pick up on some work from Sarah Schumacher's, and she wrote a really interesting article a few years ago now in the Public Procurement Law Review as to, in looking at theories of punishment and exclusion, is the exclusion of bidders, is that a backwards-looking thing, looking almost at the punishment of bidders as some sort of retribution or deterrence approach, or is it forward-looking? I say, sorry, deterrence would be forward-looking, or is it forward-looking in the sense, is it preventative? Is it preventing contracting authorities from from contracting with companies which they shouldn't be doing business with? So is it incapacitation, is it deterrence, or is it rehabilitative? And it's worth thinking about those in more details, because what is the purpose and intent of an exclusion? Is it a deterrent? Is exclusion really a deterrent from deterring companies from doing wrongdoing, or in fact doing those positive things? And of course it's only relevant if the company intends to do further public sector business. We've heard this morning that in fact, yes, of course, given the huge amount of public sector business which is available, 40% of EU GDP, then yes, the incentive actually of public sector business should be quite an important driver in encouraging companies to do the right thing. Of course, deterrence may be linked to duration of exclusion, reputational risks, and if the period of an exclusion isn't very long, it may just not be very effective, and then there's the possibility of rehabilitation. And the 2014 directives do now in Europe have that possibility of self-cleanup. Backwards looking, is it a punishment? Forward looking, it tends to be preventative. So I'm just moving through those. Yeah. So in terms of the European directives, we have mandatory and discretionary exclusions. And from the Commission's perspective, and this is back in 2006, I have to say, the communication on disqualifications stated there that the reason for the mandatory exclusion was primarily preventative. So it's not a punishment from the European perspective, it's preventative, to prevent the offender from, well, not prevent the offender, but from the company doing business with the contracting authority again, and maybe the offences which led to the mandatory exclusion. And that reduction in competition, is justified in the sense of protecting the contracting authorities from dealing with untrustworthy bidders. So, within the, let me just get through this. Yeah. Within the EU's European environment, just to sum up, we have that purpose and intent of the exclusions either being preventative, could be a deterrent, or they could be punitive. And so the general approach in the European environment is that they should be preventative, or there should be a deterrence to deter companies from doing wrongdoing, or actually to do a positive thing, to do the right thing. And certainly, Sarah Smith, who's already been mentioned this morning, has commented that in the European environment, there's little availability of punitive approach to exclusions. That exclusions are available as a sanction for discretionary exclusions. The directive gives no legal basis for punishment as such. Potentially it's looking at these two aspects of prevention and deterrence. So that's sort of the background to the exclusions. Let's look at, in practice, the EU grounds for deselection. We'll then move on to the US and quickly scan through the World Bank. So the EU has two grounds for deselection: mandatory deselection and discretionary deselection. And contracting authorities must treat a candidate as being eligible if there's actual knowledge that the candidate has been convicted of any of a list of offences. And these are the areas where the public authority shouldn't be doing business with a particular bidder. And this list in the 2014 directives has been expanded quite considerably. This is where we started to get into the social and policy aspects of it. In that under the 2004 directives, the list was much narrower, covering things like corruption. It's now being expanded to cover things like terrorist offences, to cover child labour issues and human trafficking. So we can see that this focus on social aspects of the companies that we're entitled to do business with is expanding. And this mandatory deselection obligation now has a time limit. It never had a time limit before. It now has a time limit, so it's 5 years from the date of conviction. There's always been a principle of proportionality under the European rules, and that's tended to mean that people were invited back in after a certain period, and now under the 2014 directives, it's very specific to 5 years. Deselection, again under the discretionary deselection of the 2014 rules, again has been expanded very considerably, which give the contracting authorities the discretion to exclude bidders in a wide variety of circumstances. And I've listed these out on the screen and the next screen. And again, it's moving into areas of policy and the integrity of the bidders. But it's clear that under the European approach, what we have is a situation where basically all companies are regarded as being eligible to bid for public contracts, unless they're excluded by the mandatory deselection grant or the discretionary grant. So it's very important that this concept of inclusiveness that we've been talking about, that all companies are entitled to bid unless they're excluded, which is rather different to the US ground for deselection. Where in the US there is a concept of responsibility. The agency should solicit offers from and award contracts to responsible contractors. So there's a difference in approach here in that the contracting authorities in the US are under an obligation to identify responsible contractors. And in the absence of information clearly indicating that the prospective contractor is responsible, then the officer makes a determination of non-responsibility. So the pendulum is the other way around in the States. And I think that's an interesting approach between the European and the US situation. In the European situation, all companies are generally regarded as being eligible unless there's something which specifically makes them ineligible. Whereas in the States, there is much more discretion given to the contracting officers to decide whether or not a company is responsible. And of course, there's lots of factors in the States in terms of determination of responsibility, which actually in some ways are very similar to the European grounds, but they're expressed in a much more positive way. So they must have a satisfactory performance record, a satisfactory record of integrity and business ethics. So they have to demonstrate that these factors, rather than the contracting authorities demonstrating that they don't. So that's quite interesting. There's also in the States this possibility of suspension. So at the federal level, companies can be suspended from participating in any procurement activities on a US-wide basis. We just don't have that in Europe. Everything is assessed in Europe on a case-by-case basis. So there's, in my mind, there's an open issue there as to whether we should be looking at these EU-wide suspension and disbarment mechanisms at the European level, because it does put a huge workload on contracting authorities to be assessing all these issues on a project-by-project basis. And maybe, if a company, has been convicted of corruption or doesn't meet the required standards in terms of social responsibility and sustainability, maybe they just, should be ineligible for bidding for public projects across the EU on a certain period of time. And that's, it was in the States, it's been there for a long time, and it's maybe something we can develop. And that's certainly the case in, I'll just flick through, in the World Bank. So the World Bank has a similar approach to the EU. And you can see there, I've underlined it, that in terms of selection, for World Bank funded projects, the bank permits eligible firms and individuals from all countries to bid for World Bank projects, and bidders will not be excluded, unless there is something which means that they are an inappropriate companies to do business with, particularly if they've been declared ineligible and sanctioned by the World Bank's anti-corruption guidelines. And I think we're going to hear about that tomorrow afternoon from Harris and a couple of other speakers. So that's bringing in this concept of eligibility and sanctions into the selection process. So we've got there three different processes, three different approaches to selection, and I think it's worth debating at this stage, whether particularly the European approach, should look at the rules in front of it, which are now becoming really much more complicated. The circumstances which are being identified as being reasons why a bidder should be deselected are getting much more extensive and extensive. So should we be turning it on its head and starting to be looking at that concept of responsible contractor and saying, well, it's for the bidders to demonstrate that they're responsible, rather than to be saying, there are these situations and these situations and then these situations. And you can see, in the next round of the directive, the list may get twice as long again. And then there's this issue about, suspension and disbarment on a EU-wide basis. I can see that was very controversial, but it's worth looking at. So I just want to spend the final few minutes. How much longer have I got there, Gustavo? 6 minutes, okay. So I'm just going to pick up some practitioner issues, some issues in practice. That, when we're applying these rules, then it's not that straightforward. And looking at corporate groups, looking at international issues, subcontractors, directors, ex-directors, self-cleaning, they're all quite difficult. And if there's been, let's say, a conviction of corruption in another entity within a corporate group, and I certainly had a situation where one of the bidders, which was bidding for a major project in the UK, had got a conviction of corruption in Australia. And then the question is, well, what should we do to that company? Should we exclude them or should we not exclude them? And the mandatory ground for deselection applies and extends to situations where the company has powers of representation, decision or control. So if the company which is bidding is the head company in a corporate group and the corruption occurred in a subsidiary company, then it may well be that deselection is mandatory. But if the corruption occurred and the offence was committed by a sister company, then it might be different. And interestingly, the discretionary grounds doesn't have this similar extension to controlling entities. So there's a question mark there that if you're looking at the discretionary grounds for deselection, to what extent can you take into account things which have occurred elsewhere in the corporate group? Say if the issue is international, then the particular complexities in the sense that payment of taxes in one country is very different to payment of taxes in another country. In the UK, we have this provision which talks about excluding a company which has committed any other offence within the meaning of the Article 57(1) deselection arrangement. So basically, you can apply the principle of the article to activities of other companies. And in the UK, we also have some of the Bribery Act, which means that companies can be convicted in the UK for offences which actually occurred outside the UK. So if bribery occurs outside the UK, they can still be convicted within the UK, and that would be sufficient for them to be excluded. Subcontractors, you would think, would be fairly common issue. So if the bidder is clean, but for example, if there are corruption issues with a subcontractor, then how do you deal with that? And there's actually a wide variety of views on those issues. So our UK guidance says that in that situation, the mandatory exclusion is not required. But other commentators, Sophie Williams, for example, refer to the extent to which the subcontractor is influential, is the extent of their involvement in the overall bidding process. So again, I suppose it comes back to the principle of proportionality. If you're relying on a subcontractor relating to the delivery of the project in question, then it may well be that under the principle of proportionality, the prime contractor should be excluded for the activities of the subcontractor. If it's a relatively minimal part of the overall service delivery, then maybe not. Same with directors. If the director is convicted rather than the company itself, it's pretty rare that companies are convicted. If the conviction is that of an ex-director, so simply by making a director stand down, is that sufficient to avoid these deselection grounds? And if the director no longer has powers of representation under the Article 57 grounds, then there's quite complex issues as to whether you should deselect them at that stage. And of course, we now have self-cleaning, and the bidder may demonstrate that measures have been taken to demonstrate its reliability. This is something which has been the case in German law for many years. It's now been brought into European law with the 2014 directive. It's actually a very short provision in the directives, and so it really doesn't give too much guidance. In fact, there's a case just recently, the Basel Lace case against the city of Munich, and there what was issue was that the company had demonstrated to the competition authorities that it had self-cleaned and taken steps to clean itself up. And the company was arguing that that was sufficient to mean that it shouldn't be subject to the mandatory discretion, the exclusion rule. But what the court has said, it went to the ECJ, the court has said, well, no. Actually, although the investigating competition authorities and the contracting authorities are looking at different things, then the bidder in that situation needs to collaborate both with the investigating competition authority and to cooperate with the contracting authority to be able to show that it has cleaned itself up. So though there may be different things that the bidder has to demonstrate, they need to collaborate with both. So, I'll skip over self-cleaning and just a few key takeaways. Yep, 1 minute, yep, perfect. Oops. Oh, that's interesting. Didn't know I was going to do that. So, in terms of things for us to take account of, there's still something of a lack of clarity on the nature of the exclusions. Why are we doing this? Are we being at all punitive here? Not in the European situation. In the US, with sanctions and suspension and disbarment, there's more of an emphasis on a punitive approach. The World Bank approach, where again sanctions and disbarment are very much at the fore of the system there, much more of a focus on a punitive approach. So are they a deterrent? Does the fact that you might be disbarred from bidding for public authorities, is that likely to deter companies from engaging in corruption or possibly a positive approach to taking account of the social goals? And yes, I think there's an increasing argument that given the power of public contracts, that companies are seeing the need to take account of these issues and to build them into their corporate approaches so that they can bid for public contracts. So I think that's a really positive thing. And then obviously the preventative approach, that we don't want public authorities being able to enter into contracts with inappropriate companies. Difference in approach. Is there a need for suspension and debarment in the EU? I really do think it should be looked at. It's becoming very complex on a contracting authority level on a case-by-case basis. It's a question for debate. And then the apparent simplicity of much of the EU rules actually mask considerable complexity in their practical implication. That makes it difficult for contracting authorities and procurement officials to apply these rules on a day-by-day basis. And to a certain extent, I'm a little bit schizophrenic about this last point because, as I said earlier, I don't want to see any more complexity in the rules. That we could see another 15 grounds for exclusion in the next iteration of the directives. So I do wonder whether we should look at the US approach and turn it on its head and introduce this concept of responsibility, which would then give more discretion to procurement officials to decide whether or not the companies which are bidding are responsible contractors and the public authorities should be doing business with them. So some food for thought there, and I shall hand back to Gustavo. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my research and to contribute one of the most important topic of pre-qualification in procurement practices. I sincerely thank Associate Professor Annalisa Castelli to reach out to me at Melbourne and giving me this opportunity to come all the way. So I have been told that I am the most traveled audience in this forum, 22 hours of airtime and 27 hours of door-to-door travel. So thank you for being part of this important forum. You are an esteemed group of people who knows so much about this particular topic, and I do not think that I'm highly qualified to be able to share anything more than what you guys know. But I think being an academic in one of the top universities in the world, and in Australia, I am part of the #1 University of Melbourne. I have done some research over the last few years and published some very interesting ideas around this social procurement. So this morning in the first session, two speakers clearly touched on the social side of the procurement, the social side of the bidders, and also my previous speaker also talked about a bit of the responsible bidder in the process. But there are many questions to be answered in that space, and I think this presentation here will give you some insights around that particular space. I am Hemanta Doloi, one of the academics at the University of Melbourne, as I said, and among my many other research interests, I just wanted to quickly mention about what else I do. As you can see on top logo on the left-hand side, I actually lead a research program called Smart Villages Lab, Smart Villages Research Program within the University of Melbourne. And this morning, when I have heard about the people talking about European Union, European community, and US and Chinese community, one thing is particularly missing there is the Indian community. I am an Indian by background, and you cannot simply exclude 1.3 billion people in India, which is making a big equation into the global population space. So one of the speakers in the morning talked about that we are living, quite a lot of people living in this planet. Not many people are not dying, they are living longer, and then yet we have to really create a sustainable planet. So in that equation, in that particular statement, I would like to add that Indian population of 1.3 billion in the planet is not to be excluded. So this particular conference, if you see on the very first sentence there, is to raise the awareness of planetary implications of joint decisions regarding what is purchased, how and for whom in the public domain. That clearly brings the society into our equation. So if you see this picture here, so what has happened? What is it in our traditional practice in procurement? Traditional practice in procurement is about tangible and financial outcomes. So the firms and the public procurement alike always had the tangible in their book. So up to 83% of the tangible outcomes prevail over intangibles over last many decades. Only about 17%, for the sake of having that one in the book, was the reflection of what is intangibles in the procurement practices. But then if you see over last decade or so, this equation is changing. So at this point in time, I think people have started realizing, the authorities have started realizing that intangibles really play a big role. Okay, in today's practice, many of the government authorities are giving the emphasis on intangibles, which is kind of the social capital, and that is something that we need to really talk about and look at very carefully about what it means and how we can potentially make sense of that particular intangibles in our procurement practices. So this is an example of one of the, again, a mega project that I was part of it. It was in the Bangkok city. I, as a young engineer, 23 years old, quite a few years back, I was working in this particular project, 6-lane highway on the existing roads. And many of you may have also seen this road or may have used this particular road in Bangkok city. Now, the question here is that if you just take the tangible and the intangible equation in this particular question here, tangible is very clear. Somebody has created this project and they have made money. But intangible is one of the things that we are not quite sure about, which is the social value. For whom it was created, by whom it was created, and what is the long-term implication of this particular project in that particular social context. This is very important to understand. And I'm bringing this project because I was working in this project. So, social procurement is something that I'm touching on this particular speech, and this is something that we need to really understand. I would like to actually bring some of the examples of our current government in Victoria, the state of Victoria in Australia. I looked at their policies, and in fact, out of compulsion, out of some pressure within the social groups, our government in Victorian state has committed for a social procurement framework in every single public project that they buy. So they are saying that at least 10% of the public procurement practices must have a reflection of the social procurement indicators that they have brought together in this particular framework. Then what these particular government policies have done here, as you can see, that the social value and the procurements of goods and the services, they combine together to define the social procurement. Okay, there is nothing wrong in that. So far we have been talking about the procurement of goods and services in this forum, and then a bit of social context we talked about as well. But if you see this particular picture here, it is clearly a combination of both that creates the social procurement in our Victorian context. Now, what is the biggest problem here? The problem is not about the procurement of the goods and services, not about the social procurement as we use as a buzzword, but the quantification of the social value in our public procurement. And that is where a bit of my research goes in. So, in the Victorian framework, they talk about the social procurement or social values being created within the social procurement framework by having these indicators in place. If you look at these indicators here very quickly, one of the sets of indicators here is about disengaged youth, long-term unemployed people, migrations, refugees, single parents, workers in transition. So these are the people, these are the groups of people that should get the priorities in social procurement. If any procurement practices have got a reflection of the values being created for this group of people, we call that as a social procurement. That is a very short-sighted but yet easy to follow kind of framework that they have put together. But again, citing about the reflection this morning, talking about the long-term social value, none of these indicators can actually suggest that if we have actually used in the bidding process these kind of indicators in our public procurement process, whether there is a long-term service or not, long-term value addition to the society or not is not quite sure at this point in time. So this is very important that we have a mechanism there to be able to continue monitoring and evaluating the social indicators over time so that we understand that the social bidding that we have committed in the first place has got an implication over time the way we want to. So in my research, what I did then, as I said, I was a practicing engineer, I was a researcher for quite a long time, and I'm still an academic and a researcher. So over the time, I actually created some interesting ideas to put together to quantify the social value. This is entirely my thoughts. And in fact, I was glad that after 2 years of debate, I was able to publish this particular model in one of the top journals in our field, Journal of Construction Engineering and Management by American Society of Civil Engineers. That took me about 2 years with lots of debates with the reviewers. Finally, they accept this particular model as one of the top good models in social value quantification. So what I have perceived here is this, that any social system that you want to really put in practice, you cannot simply ignore all the three integrated systems together. So these three integrated systems here are economic system, cultural system, and the political system. So you need to really bring all these things together. But now challenge here is that how can you bring all the three systems together into one single measurable outcome? So then I try to define this particular school of thoughts in this particular way, saying that the economic system, political system, and cultural system has to be integrated together to be able to create a social value of one single measure. If you can do that in any single dealings, potentially you have got a way of controlling and monitoring the value over time. So what it means to the pre-qualification of the bidders. In the pre-qualification of the bidders then, we need to somehow understand that three systems and translate that on into some sort of issues around the pre-bidding context. So if you see here, I just try to hypothesize this particular scenario within the 3D box there, but by no means that this is one of the prescriptions here. This is just a concept. So for example, in the pre-qualification of a bidder in a particular project context, we need to understand basically what we are looking at from that bidder in the context of the project. We can actually identify many different issues around the project, around the bidding, and then around the political mandate that this particular government may have within that particular project procurement. So these issues, if you can identify, that is where basically we need to understand the pre-qualification of the bidder in our screening process. So again, so far what I talked about is very much theoretical. Yes, there is a merit to that, but how to apply that one in practice? So one of the things that I again try to conceptualize here from the methodological perspective is to see what best we can do from the scientific methods perspective to understand that sort of social value perspectives in the project context. So in this case, I looked at basically traditional process versus the scientific process. And traditional process, as you can see, is a bit fragmented. Yes, cost benefit analysis, return on investment, net present value is all important parameters for economic as well as at least for the economic rationalization of the bidding process. But there are some subjectivity into that, because cost benefit analysis in the long run is something to do with how the benefit will be realized in the society. And we have got an example in Australian context, for example, and many of you have not heard it. So far, so many people have talked about the procurement processes and the practices, but not many people have ever talked about another very important element within the procurement is the kill fee. Have you heard about the kill fee? Killer's fee. So a political party at the time given a contract to a tier 1 contractor for a $6 billion project. Then the election came. During that negotiation process, contract is signed off. The initial work has already taken place. Everything is good. Then election came in. Once the election came in, the opposition party somehow capitalized on the social perception of the community, saying that, look, this particular project is not a good project. Do you agree? And once the community started agreeing with them, then they capitalized on that, taking that as a mandate to their election. And fortunately or unfortunately, opposition party came to the power, and they have then used that mandate to kill that particular project off. The tier 1 contractor of $6 billion contract has been killed off by paying one more billion overnight by the new government. So that particular project costed almost like $2 billion for doing nothing. Until now, on the ground, nothing is done, but $2 million public money has been gone into the procurement process, just to kill it off. So that is the kill fee. Not many people have heard or understood in their practices. So this is very important. So we talked about a political mandate, we talked about social connections, but at the same time, these things are very, very important to understand from the practice perspective. So in this particular model, what I have done here, as you can see from the bottom 2 lines, one is red, one is green. Traditionally, stake plus the interest are kept apart. If somebody has got a high interest, voice is quite loud. Yes? But in my practice here, I am saying that somebody may have a very high interest, but if stake is low, let voice be low. How a person sitting 3,000 kilometers away in the context of Australia, who happens to represent the green, knows that one particular bird in this particular tree comes every 4 years. This tree cannot be killed in your project. This tree has to be retained because this bird has to come every 4 years to this particular tree. This particular person may have a point as far as this particular project is concerned. His voice is big. His interest is big because he or she represents the green. But if you look at the stake is very, very low. Because this particular project happening in this particular state, and you are living 3,000 kilometers away, you have got nothing to do in terms of the project's impacts and the interest. So the stake, if this is combined together, your voice becomes low. and that is what matters. So it is not about basically who is at the center stage, but who is running the show. It's very, very important to understand that. And social network analysis is one of the techniques that I have applied as a big data theory in this particular research to capitalize, to conceptualize this particular the actor-based, stake-based equation within the social imaging. So what I'm trying to say is this, that any bidding process, any procurement process, one thing is very, very important, to set the target. And the target has to come from the society. It has to be the people. The people who are going to be part of that particular project, location-wise, beneficiaries-wise, these people have to be at the core of their decision-making process. Somehow, we need to bring these people together to understand basically how this particular project is going to be important for them, what it means to them, how they're going to live with that particular project, and that is where you have to set the target in a scale of say 0 to 100. Once you set the target, then potentially you can understand the value gap. How much is the, if you do not do it, there is no value. If you do it, how much is the value that you can create to meet the target? So this line here is very important. This is what your decision line. If you have taken a decision within the project, this decision line must close the gap to the target line so that the social value gap is reduced. And then if you do not do anything, value gap is increasing. But if you do something, you have got a potential of reducing the social gap. And in an ideal scenario, this green line, if you can merge with the blue line, that is the best project from the social context. And that is the opportunity for creating value. So, in the bidding context, what does it mean? So when you have got a particular project coming up, there are a range of various bidders coming up, you got to understand basically what are the key criteria that you like to apply in the pre-qualification of the bidders. Then how much weight you like to assign into each of those criteria, and how can you then use your stakeholder base, wider stakeholder base, to bring their perception in terms of interest, satisfaction, and their impacts to set the target and maintain that target over time. So again, I think we talked about this morning about the long-term value creation. This slide is about that. So whatever you have actually set it up in the first place, you got to make sure that the value is maintained and there is a mechanism of evaluating and monitoring the values over time. And this paper here, I cited here, is pretty much what it says about this model. So if anybody is interested in the academic journal, please look at this paper. So in our research then, again, this is a mathematical theory, I will not go into too much details, but what I try to do, that when it comes to quantifying the value, I have actually used one single criteria as a social performance indicator in the project. Social performance indicator is nothing but the functions of the stakeholders and their interest, their satisfaction, their stake, their voice, their impact, everything together. So there's a mechanism of doing that, and this particular mechanism has been explained in a mathematical formula like this, and the formula and the methodology behind is social network analysis. So I'll just quickly give you an example of how I actually quantified this particular, how I use this method to quantify the social value in these two important projects. So one project on the top is the East-West Link project in Melbourne, and that is the project that actually killed off at this moment. This project is no more exists. $2 billion is costed to kill it off. And the second project that I talked about here is the Crossrail project in London. I had a group of people from University College London who actually I worked with in a collaboration with them, and they actually helped me collecting some data from this particular project, but in a very small context. I'll talk to you in a minute. So, talking about setting the target in the very first place, as you can see, Crossrail project in London, based on the people's perception, the target was said to be 85%. Not 100% yet, but yet it's a respectable target to achieve. As opposed to the project in Melbourne, the target was only 54%. So when you have got a target of 54% of $6 billion project, you can feel that this particular project already has an issue in the social context. So 50% people are not liking this project whatsoever. So with a target of 54%, this project is nowhere close to what you can achieve as a success. So that target itself says, the target is coming from the community, by the way. Okay, what the project is going to do to you over time is what we have put together to the community, and based on that we actually come up with the target value, and that has given us 54%. So that target is not a respectable target as opposed to the cross-trail project. But yet, traditionally, if I look at the East-West Link project in Melbourne, they have done the right thing. The infrastructure linking authority has been created for this particular project, and this particular authority has reached out to all the possible stakeholders, and they put all the puzzles together in terms of understanding the stakeholder space as well as their issues. But problem is that the way they have conducted their stakeholders' participation and resolving the issues in the context of that particular project was never right, and that is the reason why that particular project failed. So in my theory, what I'm saying that there has to be an objectivity. You got to really bring every single person's voice and the interest and their impact and satisfaction in the context of a network. It's very important that one person doesn't stand up by himself or herself. It is very important that every single person within the community, be part of a network. We are all social network. Okay, it's very important. People are not living in the society by themselves. It's very important that we live in a relative society. Everyone must be included, and all the project issues must be tested with respect to every single project. So this is the model that I have put in that particular paper, as I said. So what happens here, that if you have a project in your hand, very quickly actually jot down the project issues, break the project down as much as possible to various important issues around the project, and try to understand and identify the stakeholders around the project, then connect the project issues with the people, with a particular mechanism that I developed, and that will generate your social network of the people with respect to the project issues. Once the social network and the projects are identified, eventually the network characteristics can be studied, and based on that, you can actually work on the social value target and social value outcome, and if the gap is acceptable, then you accept the project. If not, then revisit the project and redefine the project. And also, educate the people. So many a time what happens, many people in the society are not quite aware about what the project is about. Many people in the society do not know who is the right contractor to be engaged for that particular project. So this is about the lack of information within the community. And one of the biggest problems that we have got in the present time is that the mass media, one single project, one single linking authority, they will just talk about anything at every single time, every single person. You do not need to do that. So people who are interested for a particular topic, a particular issue, is the one to be targeted with a response to that particular issue as much as possible. So difficulties in that is to how to find out who are the stakeholders space, who has got what sort of interest and impact, and who are the people to talk about what aspect at any given time. So this is very difficult. But this method that we worked on actually supports a bit of those difficulties to address. So in the East-West Link project, when I actually try to set the target and try to find out the social value, I identified the social group, the stakeholders group within the project. About 44 different community groups were identified in Australia for this particular project, and this is the forum. As you can see, I brought the people over the hot breakfast and tried to understand basically what they want and what they think and how much they know about a particular project in that context. So people have been very honest, and they have given me lots of ideas about the measure that I put in place. So I tested that particular project with 6 broad issues: project selection and development, capital performance, service provisions, government plans and regulations, economic welfare, and socio-economic equity. So based on those broad issues, I was able to actually connect all the people within their network to see who communicates with who and how much people know about those issues in a very layman's term. So we found that some of the very important people who are in that network actually within the periphery of that network. So that means you can see here from the bottom line here, government actors, the people who are representing government, who are the authority of the particular project, stayed in the periphery of this particular network. So if they stay in the periphery of the particular network, then the rest of the people in the community do not have any idea about what the project is about. It's very, very important that this particular group of people takes the center stage in that particular network. So this is where the problem was. Then, analyzing further about the social network, you can see basically who are at the center stage and who are at the periphery, and you can see that this highlighted group of people who happen to be your environmental actor, end users, local government, social activists, public transport advocates. These are the people who actually took the center stage. The reason is that the government authority, they have been pushed aside to be in the periphery, so that this group actually they join their hands to topple the government's idea in respect to that particular project. So it should be other way around. The people who are in the periphery should have been in the center stage, and the rest of the people should have been part of that balanced network, and that didn't happen in the particular project. So similarly, some of the issues that people have perceived to be very important, which are the central issues, are these as opposed to some of the issues that were there. You can see here, project selection and socio-economic equity, socio-environmental equity, becomes one of the key issues as far as the public is concerned, but actually the service provision, that is one of the fundamental criteria of that particular project, from the government perspective, was one of the issues at the periphery. So that is not right. So that particular issue of service provision by that particular road, $6 billion, should have been communicated well with the community. What services this particular road is going to bring to your society and what it means to you. That was never clearly communicated with those group of people. So, using my mathematical formula that I have presented, which is not in detail, I didn't discuss in detail, but it is part of the paper. So when I did all the iterations, I found that with 54% target of our project in Melbourne, the social value by the perception of the people was just about 22%. So there was a gap of 32% as a social value. And that sort of project cannot stand in the society. It ought to fail. And that has happened really. And this failure is not because of the social value gap, but the target itself. But in the Cross-Rail project, again, I acknowledge the support of my colleagues from the University College London. They have collected some data just to compare, and this data was very much confined to one single station, Paddington Station in London, which was not quite representative, but just wanted to bring the comparison. So with the 85% target, with a small sample size within the Paddington Station, we were able to actually quantify the social value being 20%, with 68% was the social gap. But that was not a real gap in this context because of the small population size. So, take-home message is very important that rather than one-sided voice, collective voice of wider stakeholders is a must in public project. Pre-qualification criteria must ensure outcomes that are beneficial in the social context. So, big voice versus powerful voice is what we need to really look at in creating the projects. So, very last slide. Pre-qualification in social context is an emerging concept and can't be ignored in the public procurement. Pre-qualification must be linked to the long-term outcomes of the project. Social network analysis as one of the techniques which actually combines everybody together and brings the big data into your single analytical framework is important, is one of the promising methodology to be applied. And this methodology supports empowering the community, winning total support, maintaining relevance and transparency, and providing 21st century leadership in public procurement. Thank you very much.
This is the responsibilities that come with those who strongly believe in interdisciplinarity and intercultural. It seems that we have dealt with a presentation which said why is a bidder excluded, and then a presentation of why is a bidder included. But in the end, I think that basically what we had, our perspective, again, like in the previous session, but I might be wrong, I have had very little time to think it over, about what is good procurement. In a sense, you've heard that there is a focus in some countries, in some big areas, on suppliers' behavior, whether past or future, depending on the terms and other. And in other, you have put a focus on more, I believe, what is the supplier outcome or the project outcome itself. Again, we've had a reference like before on empowerment of the community. And so there's many themes that run through these two presentations, which might seem different, but they touch upon in very many ways, and it's interesting. So, yes, Roger, please.
Maybe one of the things that we're talking about here is that it's worth saying that in the European context, that when we're talking about bidder exclusion, bidder selection, and this takes us back to a very famous legal case 10-15 years ago, Leonakis, that at this stage we're looking at the backwards characteristics of the bidders concerned rather than forward-looking into the characteristics of the project. And that's sort of a fundamental aspect of the European approach. Hemanta, I think to a certain extent what you're talking about there potentially is almost qualification of the project. So assessing whether the project should go forward rather than particular bidders should be included in bidding for that project. So I suppose my question to you, Hemanta, is what you're talking about in the European perspective more of a pre-procurement exercise in assessing whether or not a project should go ahead, rather than looking at during the procurement process once a decision has been made to go ahead, which bidder should be included within that procurement process.
Yeah, I think up to a certain extent I do agree that it's more about the project qualification, but at the same time, if you look at the social procurement as your fundamental principles of procuring a particular project, bidders come with that particular equation as well. So we cannot simply exclude the bidders, because social procurement framework requires a particular set of criteria to be satisfied in that particular project, and a bidder without any right sort of competency may not come with that sort of idea that if they are the one to be selected, they are going to comply to those criteria. Again, I think that compliance and regulations that we talked about quite a lot in our previous sessions comes comes quite well in this particular context as well. So I just wanted to ask you one question in the context of that. So the particular firm that was awarded the $6 billion contract, and in the current sitting government, they had killed off that particular project, and where that particular tier 1 contractor received some compensation of some money. But how do you rate them for the next project coming up under the same government? So do you think that they have got any market credential at that point in time to deal with any sort of projects with that current government? Answer is almost no. So this particular contractor will be completely kept aside. So now I think my point here is that the contractors and the project and the regulations, that's a complete package. It cannot be separated.
Just a quick comment on that, and again from a European perspective, past performance, and this is much more explicit in the 2014 regulations, past performance is now a factor which is more available to us to take account of. As you're saying, these complex and difficult projects, then that it introduces its own complexities, in the sense that it's very rare that there are extensive track records of companies, and very often what we're looking at are consortiums of groups of companies which come together for a specific project, and the assessment of track record on that basis is really quite problematic, and you're looking at the potential capability of these consortiums. So again, I wonder whether the constraints of the European rules are a little bit too constraining in this context, and we ought to be a little bit looser.
Yeah, I might add, however, that you said you were worried about other indicators being put in the EU, right? But he seems to say that there's something that in pre-qualifying a bidder, in all the lists that Europe has created, issues of social value, issues of sustainability to pre-qualify a bidder are not yet to appear in that list, right?
That's correct. In terms of the exclusion of the bidders, I think we're moving in that direction. But mentioned something, the social value threshold, and it would be quite interesting, to see in the European concept whether we could introduce a concept of a social value threshold as being a requirement which a company needs to satisfy in order to be eligible to take part in a competition.
I just wanted to also bring another that this morning we had. One of the PhD students talked about the Chinese contractors being part of the Philippines development projects, and yet they have got the EU kind of agreement. How much that applies to that particular agreement with the contractor? So, if you do not have a social threshold, and if you do not have a particular framework in project-specific context, that kind of problem will even be more bigger. For example, if the Chinese contractors are working in a particular project in a particular country, they have got a way of, they have got a particular mode of operandi in that context. So they might bring their own subcontractors, they might bring their own labor forces, whatever it is. So then, if the social procurement framework allows or requires the local job to be grown, and particular group of local people to be given the opportunities in that particular project, so how can you incorporate that sort of criteria in the agreement of that kind? So this is another thing that I'm not quite sure about.
But I have to stop you because I have Aris, I have Evgeny, and probably other questions. Yes. Oh no, sorry, Bata then has priority over everybody. Aris.
Yes. Thank you for two very, very interesting presentations. I agree with Gustavo that although not prima facie, ultimately they are very much linked, and I would like to strengthen that link between the European and the Australian by throwing in a very interesting recent parameter that might affect the answer to Roger's question to Dr. Doloi, which is the accession of Australia to the government procurement agreement, which happened a couple of months ago, and that will create, surely, introduce certain commitments for those procurements that Australia had committed to open up. In that sense, there is a legal framework that is now imposed that will inform the extent to which this type of not project social value evaluations, pre-procurement or pre-planning, if you want, at the pre-planning stage, but with regard to the pre-selection, we may see a lot of more constraints being now applied in the Australian context. Thank you.
Well, just to comment that I suppose, as a practitioner, one of my frustrations is the difficulty in changing the government procurement agreement framework. We see it particularly in the level of the thresholds, which is, in my view, just incredibly low, really difficult to change, and that drives through into the European directives, and we can't do anything at the European level. So, in terms of procurement innovation, whilst the GPA provides a really good backdrop to the procurement rules, it is also stifling procurement innovation, and that does worry me.
So another point that I could give mention on the procurement practice and the political interventions in the context of Australia at least. So this particular project that I mentioned about that required $2 million as a kill fee not to have the project. So in fact that has triggered a long-term view of Infrastructure Australia being the authority of planning the project for 30 years. So now in Australia, our infrastructure projects are planned over 30 years period. So that is again a far too long time for infrastructure planning, but with an exception that every single state will review that 30 years plan within their political term. So 4 or 5 years, depending on, or 3 or 4 years, depending on the state, will be able to review that 30 years plan to prioritize their political, the infrastructure of the state. So that is something that is happening at this moment in Australia. But again, I like to really pass it on to the esteemed audience to see in which other countries, that sort of practice is ever followed with 30 years infrastructure planning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations, and I actually probably lawyers will agree with me. We should have agreed with the definition of pre-qualification, what it means, because two students showed completely different angles, and what Roger showed us we would consider as eligibility, not even qualification, and what you discuss is more project structuring for doing. But I have two separate questions. First of all, as Roger mentioned, it's ever-growing number of different exclusions. Do you see any opportunity to find a common denominator to define this eligibility in more general terms, and then different legislative framework, international organization will be able to fit into that, so minimize the number of pages and save the trees from being cut and printed this ever-growing list of exclusions, though it will grow for sure with regionalization, deglobalization. We will see more and more sanctions and separation lines. And the question to Mr. Doloi, you quite interestingly mentioned that just before my question, that the horizon for planning for 30 years. At the same time, we're living in a society when people expect immediate delivery. They click button on Amazon, afternoon, everything is delivered. And also, we mentioned the social aspect and stakeholders engagement. We also have this issue when people permanently dislike people on social media, Instagram, Facebook. There is a very interesting series in the UK called Black Mirror, on the show people instantly have to like or dislike persons that face in the street, how it affects their personalities. How do you reconcile long-term planning horizons with immediate expectation of immediate gain and benefits very often people would like to have? And also this so-called common knowledge, which not necessarily represents the objective knowledge, despite the big data. So, for example, if you go back to 17th century, everyone thought that Earth is flat, and if it was Wikipedia at the time, we will read how flat it is. But in reality, we know it is not the case. So how to reconcile these two contradicting things? Thank you.
Evgeny's first question, which is how do we stop the ever-expanding list of exclusions in the European Union? I think the key answer to that is in this room, and the competence of procurement officials, and comments which were made so many years ago by Professor Eukins about the balance between procurement competence and the degree of strictness of the legal framework. And I think that's a really important concept for us to grasp. And it's a common theme in Professor Eukins' work that where you have a more competent cadre of procurement officials, then the degree of strictness of the procurement rules can be less strict, in that you can give a lot more discretion to the procurement officials, because it's not simply a box-ticking exercise, as we were saying earlier. It becomes a professional exercise, and the control against corruption which supposedly can come from a box-ticking exercise, it can be dealt with by the increasing professionalisation of procurement officials. So, I think we're potentially moving to that situation in Europe where we've got an inconsistency between an increasingly professionalised group of procurement officials, and that's broader than Europe as well. They're obviously looking at on a much more broader basis here, and yet an increasingly complex series of procurement laws, which actually is somewhat becoming unnecessary now. If you take Professor Yupin's analysis to heart, which I think I do, to a certain extent, the legislators could back off a little bit, give more discretion to the procurement officials, as the way they do to an extent in the States, and get away from this huge long list of specific exclusions, the box-ticking exercise, and looking much more of a principles-based approach, where people can assess issues on a case-by-case basis.
But the story of the US is a story where gradually discretion has become the name in town, right? Europe has still to do a long way.
That's correct. But I think we're moving in that direction.
So answering the second question there, I think at this moment the mass media is the one to blame in a way. So what has happened really, at the moment I'm just talking about another project in Melbourne, which is the metro project, underground train project is happening in Melbourne at this moment. And before this particular project again came up, government is very committed that we have to do the mass transit system, and metro train is of course required. The media has picked up one particular person with a white t-shirt and a knife in the middle. So there are two knives on his t-shirt, and this man was on a big photo on the front page newspaper of The Age, which is one of the biggest widely circulated newspaper in Australia. He was on the front page saying that look, not again. The topic was, not again, I do not let anybody bulldoze my house for the sake of any project in Melbourne. That was the front page newspaper topic on that particular day. And my 6-year-old boy picked up that and saying that, look, Daddy, why this government is doing so much bad to the community, and why these people have to lose their houses when they are doing the projects in Melbourne, for whom they are doing it. And a 6-year-old boy has picked up that particular newspaper, news article and talked to me about that, and I had no idea. But the question here is that this person who has appeared on that newspaper will be eventually compensated for the sake of public project, and one particular person with his house, if it has to go, there's a way of compensating that particular person. Right? So there's a tactical decision to be made, and there's a way of compensating adequately of the particular citizen. But media is not doing the right thing by inflating that sort of news onto the front page media. So this is one of the ways. And then another idea that I have presented here is about looking at the interest and the stake. So in this case, the particular person who is sitting on, who is appearing in the newspaper has got some sort of interest, vested interest, to be in that newspaper and maybe getting money from some media. But if you look at the stake of that particular person, maybe that person may not be the right person in the right house. Who knows? Nobody knows. So the stake and the interest have to be combined together to be able to rationalize the voice and the impact of the community. So I think that is where we are not quite doing right at this point in time. So mass media is to be blamed at this moment. Every single information for every single person in the community is not required in every single decision-making process.
But then we don't say everyone must be included.
It's a targeted audience in a target kind of response. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So, but then we have to take into account the huge amount of transaction costs of sentences like everyone must be included.
That is the dilemma we have when scientifically how can we do it?
But finally, your time. Your time has come.
My intuition told me that two sessions are interrelated, and you exactly said that. And first of all, thank you very much for your presentation, because very often when we are sitting in different working groups, I have simple question: why we are here? And many are confused, asking why are you asking that simple question. But I said, we have to define what is the public interest, because you have contracts and you have public contracts, and what is the difference? Exactly, public interest. And who is going to define that public interest? How to reach as much as possible the best definition of public interest? Because you have priorities. You have limited financial resources, so it is not just what is in public interest, but what is at this moment priority. And how you can define it? Of course, we have two aspects always. Technical aspects, how to provide appropriate data, analysis, different economic and so on. And on the other side, you have different political interest of certain groups and so on. So, the most important thing is, what I did always when I was in the government, to convince politicians that certain public interest is in their private interest. It was very functional. First of all, also, you have to include everyone, or at least to give the opportunity from the early stage of defining that public interest and which project should have priority. In Serbia, there was Prime Minister, very often he was saying, I was not informed. If someone is not informed, he is against certain project. If he or she had the opportunity to say something, it is extremely important. At least you reduce the level of possible conflict, that someone later on blocked it. Another thing, we need so-called co-ownership, because if it's not the project of this or that party or whatever, then implementation will be much easier. On the other hand, what you said, education. If you are delivering information about possible projects, advantages, disadvantages, people start to think. And if they are involved, or they feel that they can be involved, then the results would be much better. Related to how to exclude, whom to exclude, of course, you have two aspects. One is my field, it is legal aspect. When some body, or is it court or someone else, decided that someone guilty for something, then of course you have several elements. First, I should not be possible to participate on one side. It will not reduce competition, it will provide fair competition. And on the other side, people will think in advance not to participate in certain activities. But on the other side, this discretionary power is very important. Who can provide the best results of certain project? And that is exactly what is related to other criteria. So, very often, for example, in Transparency International in our country, think there is discretion, there is corruption. No, there is discretion, there should be higher responsibility. And it is connected with the knowledge, and I support what Evgeny said, that Tor Vergata and Belgrade is the place to raise the knowledge. And finally, always with the anecdote. We've been working on one very important law, and of course there were lobbyists sent by some ministry. My colleague was very nervous. 5 hours he tried to convince them in something, and he tried to convince me to convince them. I said, I'm just an expert. And then someone came and he said, listen people, finish this, soup will get cold. It is related also to this moment. And then I said, okay, can we change this article like this? In 5 minutes we finish it. So there are different techniques to get to the public interest. I'm not saying that there should not be more questions.
So no risk of being cold with this weather, but still an important point was raised. Hemanta, do you want to close up on this?
I think, look, very spot on comments, and thank you very much again. I think I really enjoyed as much as you may have enjoyed this session here, and learned a lot from the previous two speakers, as well as Roger talked about something very important in terms of the disqualification and exclusion and inclusions. And I definitely come from a bit of an academia kind of perspective. I hope that that has given you some sort of understanding about the new practices required. So one thing that we all understand we forget in the practice, but academic community understand very well that all the practices that we are working on in today's world is all about the results of some sort of research maybe somebody has done in the past and published some knowledge. So published knowledge is what currently the practice is, but we should not forget that knowledge is still evolving. So there must be different ways of evolving the knowledge over into the future. As the society is changing, 21st century is a different society from 20th century, and 22nd century will be a different society altogether. So it is very important that we are open and we let the knowledge grow and our practice actually adapts to the new knowledge.
Very quickly, Roger.
Just a very quick comment, and really just a further linkage between what I was talking about and Hemanta's talk. And that's one thing I skipped over in my presentation was the exercise of discretion. That under the European rules, you have mandatory exclusions, you have discretionary exclusions. Well, how do you exercise the discretionary responsibility? And one of the things that really attracts me about what Hemanta's talking about and expanding that in other ways is that it gives something of a framework for the exercise of those discretionary responsibilities, which I think is really attractive.
One quick last question from our colleague from China here, and then we're off for lunch.
My name is Yung Zhao from University of International Relations in Beijing, China. It's my great honor to be here to participate in the interesting conference, and I believe our participation will make this conference more global. I'm very interested in the second speaker, I think Professor Hemanta. He analyzed and studied the government procurement issues from the economic perspective. I'm doing the similar things for 26 years. And my question is, when we talk about pre-qualification or qualification, it's more or less like a true or false choice. And I agree with you, totally agree with you, that public participation is one of the keys of the success of the government procurement project. And my question is, when we calculate, when we involve the data and calculations with the result of the public opinions into government procurement, why the results comes to a true or false choice other than weighing factors that would be a more precise and quantitative analysis? That's my question.
Yeah, I guess it's not about true and false choice at the end. It is about weightings around your priorities. So I think many people here are consultants, and I think that consultants one very interesting principle that they follow, that they never prescribe something very specific to any problem. They always give the recommendation. So it is not about true and false, but this is about, as I said, some of the important criteria to be considered and the weightings around them. Eventually, at the end, the decision makers are the one to make the decision according to their needs. So that is what basically our research should do.